Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we are pro voluntary cooperation and anti coercion. This is episode 68, and we're going to take a look at climate change. Is it science or conspiracy theory? Now, science basically consists of people doing experiments, right? They come up with a hypothesis, they see something, they come up with a hypothesis to try to explain it. And then they test it out, right? So they conduct experiments, do research, and we talked about this a bit in the previous episode. So the thing that we have to keep in mind is that scientists are people, just like you and me. And as with all people in general, there are some people who do things better than others. There are other people who are more susceptible to the temptations that are out there in the world. Nevertheless, to go do a brief overview of some of the things that people are saying about climate change. In favor of climate change, we can see that over 90% of all scientists agree that climate change is real and that the world is getting warmer and warmer. We have pictures of starving polar bears, and that's clearly because the polar ice caps are melting, and so therefore the polar bears can't find anything to eat. And then, of course, there are all those smart people out there who say, yeah, climate change is real. Global warming, that's a serious problem. We just got through a season of global boiling. If you were listening to the news, that's what they were saying about summer here in the United States. A lot of people's teachers, right? The smart people in the room with all those young, yet to learn anything students, they're smart and they all say that climate change is real. All the schools teach it. They have science fairs and offer prizes to winners of these science fairs given to people who come up with fantastic solutions to prevent and reverse the course of climate change. Greta Thunberg said that we have climate change. No one's canceling her, so she must be right? Because misinformation is canceled and banned, and she's allowed to continue to talk, so she must be speaking truth. Also, pollution. I mean, pollution is everywhere. You just see it. But look at those windmills, no exhaust. Right. So green energy is the future. It's cheap, it's renewable, and fossil fuel is just dirty. And probably we're going to run out of fossil fuel in like 20 years. But as I said, scientists are just simply people as well. They are paid to say certain things, to study certain things. If you go back to one of the earlier first few episodes, we talked about knowledge production. Where does knowledge come from? Well, people are paid to make knowledge from a certain subjectivity, right? So imagine you have a room full of scientists and they all apply for a grant. And so you have all these different ideas floating around, but you get to decide which idea is funded, right? And so you understand, if you know how to play the game, you submit your proposal based on the trends of society, what you think that the judges are going to think is a great idea. And so you shape your pitch, your proposal, to match the expectation and the desires of the people who are going to award money. And so, of course, people who follow the political narrative the best, they get most of the money. And a lot of other ideas, they're not funded at all. So it's not so surprising that 90% of scientists will say the same thing, because there are gatekeepers to the flow of information. If we move beyond just simply getting grants for scientific research studies, the editors of journals, they have bias as well. And so, especially if politics has entered into the whole scientific journal community, then only certain articles will be published. And if you go back to that earlier stat that said over 90% of all scientists agree that there is climate change, you'll notice that they add that when they examine all of the published journal articles, nearly all of them, or over 90% of them, all agree climate change is real. And see, that's how you create such a high, seemingly near consensus percentage. You control who gets published and who doesn't get published. And so even though you go back to the 1970s, the scientists were proposing to melt the polar ice caps because it was getting too cold in the world. So it was global cooling, then it became global warming. And then because the temperatures weren't changing all that much, they decided to call it climate change. And people buy it because certain people are paid to say it. You hear it everywhere. And so therefore it must be true. Again, as I'm saying, and you can tell, I'm going to move to the conclusion that it's simply subjective, right? So the data is subjective. Depending on your subjectivity, you are going to say that your conclusion is this or that. One might even go so far as to say that the information is cherry-picked in order to satisfy or to make stronger the conclusion that you desire to make. Right. And so we talked about gatekeepers of information, just like with the surveillance. That's how you get 90% of science agreeing to a certain understanding of the phenomena that they're talking about. You silence anyone who has a different opinion, and you publish and make available and you broadcast and you blast it every media outlet that you can find with this pro-surveillance kind of rhetoric. All right, which is why a lot of people in government were so eager to shut down social media, to control social media so that they can control completely the narrative. But obviously, even superficially thinking about it, and if you understand even basic science, you know that there's something going on, which allowed certain media outlets to continue to allow certain people to be able to speak. And of course, some people already knew it and were eager to be able to spread it to other people who are very suspicious of what was going on. So who is smart, right? If all the smart people are saying it, well, what's smart? Well, smart is subjective. And we talked about this with the whole idea of the expert, right? Expert implies smart in that field, smart in that area. Well, knowing a lot about something doesn't necessarily mean that one becomes an expert in living everyone's life, right? So knowing something in theory does not necessarily guarantee and ensure that someone knows how to make which hard choices, right? So it's one thing to talk in a room and not have to feel any of the repercussions of the policies that you are pronouncing onto everybody else, especially since you do not abide by the very policies you're forcing everyone else to follow. I don't know if anyone remember this, but there was a certain chief of NIH who went to a baseball game and did not wear a mask. And of course, at the same time, other people were getting arrested for not wearing one. So see, you can see that certain people did not have to pay the price, did not have to comply with all of the rules that were being imposed on everybody else. And I talked about that before, how over the last 3 years, my Zoom backgrounds were just simply article headlines of politicians who do not follow their own legislation, right? So open hypocrisy. So who is an expert? It's all very subjective. And then Greta Thunberg, of course, she's a hypocrite, right? She met with Zelensky, and basically supported the war, even though war is the biggest polluting human activity in the world ever, right? Everything's blowing up, everything's burning. and for her to sit there and, and do that is pretty funny. Also, has anyone ever seen a burning windmill? Because that happens a lot, right? They get overheated and they break and they spew a tremendous amount of smoke. And it can easily be imagined that the amount of CO2 that is released as a result of this isolated in the middle of nowhere with no chance of being put out quickly windmill, the amount of smoke that is spewed out of there will far exceed any saving of CO2 production that the windmill would be able to create in its entire 20-year lifetime. Because after 20 years, they have to be rebuilt. And nothing about those windmills are recyclable. And so they're just simply buried in the ground. I think we talked about that before. And so windmills, for a brief period of time, seem to be a great idea. But of course, they're super expensive and they're killing whales, right? So a lot of windmills, and I think I mentioned this before, but a lot of windmills are being made in the ocean. So how do you secure the windmill in the middle of an ocean where there are 30-foot waves that can easily destroy these windmills? Well, you got to make sure they're solidly in the ocean floor, which of course, all of the banging and the drilling drives whales and other sea creatures nuts. And so just even here on the East Coast, the northern part of the East Coast, there are like 60, 70 whales that have washed up onto the beach and they're dead, right? Because all of that drilling, all that pounding to set up these windmills, just driving them crazy, right? Because their whole life is all about the sonar. And so the sound is just driving them crazy. So it's interesting, right? It's with fossil fuel that people stopped hunting whales, but now that we're going green, the whales are in jeopardy again. We come full circle. Also, solar panels, the only reason why, well, there are a couple of reasons why they're so cheap, quote unquote. Number one, the price of silver is pretty low, comparatively speaking, for especially in the face of the demand for silver. But also, most solar panels in the world are subsidized by the government. And so they are actually much, much more expensive than they appear to be because taxpayer funds were already used to pay for much of the manufacture. And so in China, coming from China, we have most of the cheap solar panels. I don't think most Americans who are pro-green and yet anti-China understand that. But of course, the Chinese people are taxed to be able to subsidize the production of solar panels to be sold all over the world. So there's that. Also, fossil fuels, will run out in 20 years or 5 years or whatever. I've heard that ever since I was 10, and that was nearly 50 years ago. So I don't know. They'll say lots of things. People will believe it because there's, 20 years later, no one's going to hold anyone accountable. They'll say, hey, you said we were going to run out, but we're still using it, that kind of issue. So all of this stuff about climate change is hypothesis driven, right? It's driven by science. And so people have a hypothesis and then they go basically look for information to validate it, to justify it, for certain people to make the kinds of conclusions that they want to make, right? And so you see a lot of data manipulation, and they don't consider other factors, other consequences, and other costs, right? So it's a hypothesis. So you can see that it's kind of science, but maybe we'll call it really bad science, right? Or naive science, right? Because it's as if there's nothing else that could possibly be affected, right, by drilling and pounding these windmills in the middle of the ocean. Like nothing else will be bothered by it. No one sees the dead whales. No one sees all of the ocean life that is being destroyed so that we can have these windmills in the middle of the ocean, right? So it's just either naive or it's just really bad. And so there's that. So it's kind of science, right? but it's extremely, extremely subjective science. And keep in mind that science is subject to change. We've talked about this several times with Galileo, also in the 1970s when they talked about global cooling. And then you might say, well, what about all those computer models that tell us we're all going to be underwater in a couple of years? Well, that's the thing. They're computer models. And computer models that run an algorithm or run a program that tries to predict what will happen in the future is completely dependent on the information that is fed into it and also the formulas that have been programmed into it, right? So just because a computer does something doesn't mean that it's independent, that it's accurate, but it can only function according to its programming. I mean, look at ChatGPT, for example. It's programmed to reject anything that's not part of the political agenda of the people who are in power at the current time. Take your pick, right? It can swing in any way. And so that's why I'll frame it that way. Just because Democrats will no longer be in power doesn't mean that everything will become objective. No, it'll just be skewed in a different way. If you change the hypothesis of a lot of the scientific experiments that people are using to justify the reality, so-called, of climate change, well, if you change the hypothesis, you change your data source, right? You examine different things, and then you weigh them against your initial results, you will probably get different conclusions, right? And we'll get to that in a moment. So it's a kind of science, as I said, but it's also part conspiracy theory as well, right? So it's the worst of both worlds. Well, how can it be a conspiracy theory? Well, I mentioned earlier that when you have these science fairs or government grants, you have to imagine that if there are people who want to promote solar panels or windmills in the ocean, you have people lined up who are going to basically carry out all of that activity. In other words, they're going to get paid to do it. And anything the government pays for is astronomically priced, right? There's no competition in the bidding process, right? It's not like, oh, that person said they'll do it for $1 billion. I'll do it for 900 million, right? There is no competition that way. These contracts are given to politically connected people, whether they're competent or not. It does not matter. It doesn't mean that they are the best. It just means that they are the most politically connected. And so there's a tremendous amount of overpayment. Who do you think is getting overpaid? Right? Politicians, people who know politicians, families of people who are connected to politics. Okay. So there's the conspiracy, right? So lots of people getting together in secret to do something which is subjectively could be considered harmful. So you got both of it. You got the naive bad science, and then you got the negative understanding of conspiracy theory. And we went over conspiracy theory in the last episode. So let's take a step back, bigger picture, right? The reality is that climate change is only sometimes important, right? So war is the biggest polluter of the planet. And so if people really were serious about climate change, then they would be pro-peace whenever possible. Anything to avoid conflict, even if it means that a certain political entity that you don't like is then swallowed up and swallows up another entity that you were taught to like, that a couple years ago you didn't care you didn't care at all for. You didn't even know it existed, but now all of a sudden you got to go spend billions of dollars to try to save something which is potentially the most corrupt government in all of Eastern Europe, which is saying something, right? So you'd be anti-war. Also, there's a guy, Dan Pena, P-E-N-A, I believe that's how you pronounce it, Pena. I saw a little clip that he made on YouTube, and it was I'd never heard this before, but it makes sense. I've made similar arguments, but not like this. But banks and insurance companies, if they see their whole business is based in the future, right? Mortgages, premiums, payouts, all that kind of stuff. When they insure buildings, or when banks give out the loans for the construction of beachfront property, there would be climate change clauses in all of it, but there's nothing, which tells you that they know, insurance companies and banks know that it's subjective, right? That, yeah, you can create information and knowledge which proves that it exists, or you don't have to. Okay, so there's that bigger picture thing that not everyone is on board with this. And those companies, insurance companies and banks, are not in the news either. They don't take any heat at all for denying the sort of proposed or supposed scientifically proposed climate change Armageddon that's coming, right? But no one cares because most people don't understand just how the economy works, right? And so that's how they can be easily overlooked. Also, keep in mind that it is extremely expensive, and who's going to pay? And then who's going to pay whom? In other words, who's getting all that money that is being spent to do all of this climate change mitigation stuff, right? And it's not just in terms of money, but it's costs and the quality of life, wasted time and resources, the biodiversity. We talked about burning down rainforests to grow palm trees so that the biofuel mandate can be satisfied here in the United States. It's just so weird. All of this waste, which ends up creating even more pollution with absolutely zero results. Keep in mind also that CO2 is necessary for plant life, which is why I always say that the climate change thing is the war against green plants, right? It's a war against green plants. Now, you don't want green plants to thrive. I saw this video on greenhouse grown plants, and they need to pump CO2 into the greenhouse because the plants inside the greenhouse use up all the CO2 and then they stop growing. But if you pump in and maintain a high level of CO2, the crop yields go off the charts, right? They're much more in terms of yield, growth. You can grow this stuff more frequently as well. This would be great for poor countries, right? Especially poor countries that need the energy. They are energy starved. And to set up all these so-called green energy initiatives, it's extremely expensive. So in other words, you can't have poor countries, people who live in poor countries being fed and maintain the green agenda. You can't do both. So either they all starve to death, or you got to forsake the green energy agenda in poor countries, right? And so what are they going to use? They're going to use fossil fuels. The reality is that the more modern a country is, the less pollution they produce. And of course, the bigger picture is that most of the preachers of climate change are hypocrites. They ride around in their private jets, creating so much pollution, but it really doesn't matter. And that's how you know it's all talk. And everything that they do is just simply for the rest of us plebes, right? So they're the elites. They get to do whatever they want. And with all their power and authority, they get to control all of our lives. There are so many other things that we can talk about. And this is just simply the tip of the iceberg of all of the problems. And I'm sure you have your favorite argument you use to show how problematic it is. But here, at the end of it all, believe whatever you want, right? If you want to believe that we're all going to die in 5 years, go ahead, right? But those of us who have other concerns like feeding our families, we don't have to really think about it so much. So in other words, believe what you want, but pay for your choices. Understand that there is risk in all belief. We said that earlier when we talk about religion, right? There's always a risk that what you believe is true is not. And so who's going to pay for that risk? Who's going to take that risk? It should be the person who is making the choices. And what we can see with this whole green agenda is that the people who preach it the loudest pay nothing. They are the ones who are paid by the rest of us, because we are sort of legislated to have to pay for it all, whether through direct taxation or through inflation. And if everyone had to actually pay for the choices and take responsibility for the choices that they make, then we will quickly see if what all these theories are really conspiracy theory or not, if it was real science or not. But because all of these price signals are distorted, right, because the prices are skewed because of subsidies, legislation, and the Fed printing all that money, no one will ever really be able to clear the air to see what is actually science and what is simply the negative application of conspiracy theory. So in the meantime, the correct direction is to leave people alone and allow them to build the structures that make the most sense for them. You will quickly see that people don't like to pollute their backyard. And if there was a better option, they would go for that option. Okay. And so leave people alone. Allow people to have to pay for the choices that they make, and then leave them alone. But people naturally, I'll reiterate, people naturally choose the method and the solution that pollutes the least. And top of that list, they would rather pursue peace than war. And that's it for this one. I'll see you in the next episode.